Chapter 22:43. No matter what, the little mushroom was coaxed to sleep. By the time Cher came out of the bathroom, the little guy was already eating his fingers, his chubby little body turned sideways, and his little face was soft. Cher sighed again. She had raised this child to be like her own flesh and blood. Every move he made was like her when she was young. Asleep? She wiped her hair with a towel and walked over softly. She naturally leaned over and kissed the little guy who smelled like milk. Lan Yu sat by the bed and smiled faintly. I still can't get rid of the habit of eating my fingers. His gaze unexpectedly fell on her face and then moved down, to the spring scenery in front of her. Lan Yu's gaze became a little deep and distant. He didn't look at her for long and then got up. Let's go to the bathroom. I'll help you dry your hair. Cher looked up. Go to sleep first. I'll do it myself later. Lan Yu was already leaning against the door of the bathroom. He looked at her deeply. Is there anything different? What? Cher's voice was light. Lan Yu's gaze deepened. He looked at her unfathomably and said softly, and, is there any difference between B City and New York? She held her breath and looked at him for a long time. Finally, she lowered her little head and moved her lips slightly. No. He smiled and walked over slowly. He reached out and stroked her long hair. That's good. He walked past her and entered the bathroom. Cher was still standing there in a daze for a while before she followed him in. Lan Yu was already waiting for her with the hairdryer. She walked over and stood in front of him consciously. She was only 162 while Lan Yu was 182. In the mirror, she looked especially small. Lan Yu closed the door and held her hair with one hand and began to dry it for her. Under the rumbling sound of the hairdryer, no one made a sound. It seemed that this kind of sound just happened to be able to eliminate the subtle atmosphere between them. As for what was wrong, Cher couldn't put her finger on it. Lan Yu should know about Yi Muyun, but he didn't ask. He just told him, just like before. However, was it really the same? She peeped at him in the mirror, but it was foggy and she could not see very clearly. What's wrong? Is there something on your mind? Lan Yu smiled gently and looked at her in the mirror. Similarly, he could not see her clearly. Cher shook her head. No. Don't move. He pressed one hand on her shoulder. When their skin touched, Cher's body stiffened. He obviously felt it too, but he just smiled. With great difficulty, he helped her dry her hair and patted her. Done. Oh. She pursed her lips, looked up at him, and did not say anything else. Lan Yu naturally put his arm around her shoulder and took her to the master bedroom. His voice was calm and gentle. Go to sleep. We'll take Ishu to the amusement park tomorrow. He paused for a moment. He made a fuss, saying that he hasn't seen you for a long time. Cher's expression was a little stiff. She looked up at Lan Yu and finally said, okay. At this time, they had already walked to the bed together. Lan Yu pressed her shoulder. Good night kiss. With that, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Cher instinctively turned her face away. Lan Yu's lips touched her hair, but he did not force it. He just slightly looked at her. I'm going to the guest room. With that, he walked out. Cher looked at him from behind, pursed her lips and did not say anything. Chapter 22:44. After the door was closed, she slowly lay down beside Xiao Yishu. She reached out and held the little boy in her arms, feeling his softness. Xiao Yishu smelled like milk. She rested her chin on his little head. She could understand why Yi Muyun always hugged and smelled her when she was young. Cher pursed her lips even tighter at this thought. A few days had passed. How was he? She called Guzet once, but Guzet said that he was not at work and did not know where he was. She did not know how she had been these days. She could not let go of him, but she did not dare to care about him. What reason did she have to care about him now? And he must hate her to the core. She closed her eyes in frustration. But when she closed her eyes, her mind was filled with Yi Muyun's ashen face. Cher did not sleep well that night. Early the next morning, she was woken up by Xiao Yishu's kiss. Mommy, 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 mommy. The little boy lay on his stomach, his chubby little hands wrapped around Shue's neck. Cher couldn't do anything about him. She opened her eyes, hugged him, and kissed him hard. Yishu, let mommy sleep a little longer. Just for a while. Xiao Yishu lay in her arms obediently. But it only lasted for a while before he started to cling to her again. And Cher had an exclusive way to deal with Yishu's clinging, which was to pretend to be dead. She closed her eyes and pretended not to be awake. Xiao Yishu looked at her mother. It was useless to pinch her nose. After thinking for a while, she finally got out of bed. He left. Cher breathed a sigh of relief and prepared to take a nap. But only 5 minutes later, Xiao Yishu's footsteps sounded again. She let the little boy kiss her face. Yishu, let mommy sleep a little longer. It's 9 o'clock. Are you sure you still want to sleep? A deep male voice rang in her ears. Cher suddenly opened her eyes and stared at Lan Yu in a daze. It took her quite a while to come back to herself and slowly sat up. It's you. Lan Yu was already neatly dressed in a white shirt and a pair of black trousers. Standing like this, his legs were 2.8 meters long. He smiled faintly. The little guy is already eating breakfast. He's waiting for you. Cher nodded and scratched her messy hair, feeling a little uncomfortable. Okay. He smiled and quickly walked out. Cher got out of bed and walked into the bathroom to brush her teeth. While brushing her teeth, she stared blankly at herself in the mirror. In fact, she had been sleeping in separate rooms with Lan Yu ever since they got married. She didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. She had never felt uncomfortable living with him, nor had there been too much pressure. Although they were husband and wife, they were more like master and disciple. He was the one who guided her in painting and she often called him Teacher Lan. After living together for a long time, she felt that life was probably like this. However, there was still someone else in his heart. But when she came back, she still hurt him. If she didn't come back, would he give up in 2 years and marry Song Karen? Cher thought about it in a daze. After brushing her teeth and washing her face, she tidied up a little and went to the living room. Breakfast was prepared by Lan Yu in the kitchen. He made Yishu's favorite honey bread. At this moment, the little boy was enjoying it. Shuai sat down beside her, and the little fellow gave her a peck on the lips before burying her head in her work again. Chapter 22:45. Lan Yu sat opposite her and smiled. Are you blaming me for making him fat these days? Cher snorted softly, indicating that she meant it. Lan Yu's smile deepened. Then I'll leave the rest to you. No, you take care of it. She expressed her disgust for the kitchen. Lan Yu didn't say anything more, but just rubbed the little guy's head. Son, eat less. Your mommy doesn't like you anymore. I didn't say that. Cher opened her eyes wide. Xiao Yishu looked at Cher and called out, Mommy. Her voice was soft and sweet. Cher said helplessly, You'll be cuter if you're fatter. So Xiao Yishu ate 2 more honey bread than usual. Lan Yu looked at her disapprovingly. This won't do. Cher simply stared at him. Lan Yu shrugged. picked up his empty cup, and poured himself another cup of coffee. He was tall and very good-looking, completely different from the poor painter in her impression. He also had a faint aristocratic aura. Cher hadn't asked his family, but she could feel that he came from a good family. From the big apartment in New York that he arranged for her to the car that he drove, it wasn't something that a painter could afford. She had been a little absent-minded, and Lan Yu would inadvertently look at her, but she didn't notice it at all. She also didn't notice that the way that the man looked at her had quietly changed in the past few years. After breakfast, Lan Yu held Xiao Yishu while Cher carried her backpack. The three of them went downstairs, got into the car and went to the zoo. Hay Garden. Yi Muyun sat in the hall on the first floor. The autumn sun shone brightly into the hall, but it couldn't shine into his heart. Compared to before, he was a little thinner, and there was a sense of coldness all over him. In front of him stood a young man in casual clothes. He had a sun hat on his head and a camera on his body. He looked like a photographer. "Mr. Yi, this was taken today. Miss Tang didn't leave the hotel for the past 2 days." The young man handed a stack of photos to Yi Muyun. Yi Muyun sat on the sofa. His pure white bathrobe made him look extremely handsome, but it could be seen that his body was even thinner around his loosened collar. His dark eyes were unfathomable as he said lightly, "You may leave first." The young man did not dare to stay any longer and immediately retreated. After that person left, the surroundings became quiet again. Yi Muyun lowered his gaze and quietly looked at the stack of photos on the table. Finally, he picked them up and looked at them one by one. Every picture was of a family of 3 together. The child was almost always carried by Lan Yu or sat on his shoulder, while Cher was always by his side. Occasionally, when there were many people around, her hand would be held by the man. Yi Muyun looked at them one by one. She looked at them very carefully, but the pain in her eyes grew heavier. He desperately wanted to find some information, but there was none. Lan Yu and Tang Cher were like the most peaceful couple in the world. They did not need to do much to show that they were in harmony. Suddenly, he was swept to the ground. If they were in harmony, then what about him, Yi Muyun? What about the days they spent together in Yunnan? When they made love, her pandering, what did it matter? The photos floated down like snowflakes, blocking his expressionless face. Chapter 2246. When Guzé came over, he saw such a scene. His expression froze and he sighed in his heart. "How's the investigation going?" Yi Muyun raised his eyes. There was an indisputable scarlet in his eyes. Guzé sat opposite him and said slowly, "They got married 5.5 years ago in New York." Yi Muyun's face trembled and his fingers clenched into fists. What about the child? He didn't know why he asked. The child was obviously only 5 years old, but his heart was yearning for the most impossible possibility. Guzé shook his head gently. "According to Lan Yishu's birth certificate, she's only 5 years old." Sure enough. He should have thought of it long ago. Yi Muyun closed his eyes. Why did he still have that kind of expectation in his heart? It was ridiculous and pitiful. Yi Muyun covered his eyes with his fingers and said softly, "Guzé, let me be alone for a while." At this moment, he couldn't move, as if all the strength in his body had been sucked away. Guzé was worried, but he couldn't disobey, so he nodded. "I'll be in the car outside." He knew Mr. Ye's feelings for Cher. From 10 years old to 30 years old, how could he let go of a relationship that had lasted for 20 years? After 8 years, Mr. Ye's love had become twisted and stubborn. Guzé didn't know what to say. He didn't have the right to say anything. His sister, Gumei, was also involved in what happened 8 years ago. He left quietly, leaving the space for Yi Muyun. Yi Muyun leaned against the sofa and placed his fingers on his eyes. After a long time, there was liquid slowly flowing from the gap between his slender fingers. He didn't care about it and just sat there quietly. At that moment, he heard the sound of his heart tearing. It was like a piece of cloth being torn open. It hurts, it hurts. His handsome face contorted in pain. He squatted down and frantically searched the ground. Finally, he found a photo of her alone. She was wearing a thick sweater, carrying a small bag, and looking up at the sun. She was smiling faintly, revealing her canine teeth. It was how he remembered her. It was him, the little Cher whom he had loved for so many years, his little heart. It was his heart, his entire life. He knelt on the ground and stared at her. Suddenly, he squeezed the photo into his own mouth and squeezed it with all his might. He cried bitterly. This was the darkest day of his life. This was the most embarrassing moment of his life. However, she was not here. She belonged to someone else. Guze was sitting in the car outside when he suddenly heard a heart-wrenching sound that almost tore at his heart. The cigarette at the tip of his finger trembled. He wanted to rush into it, but he resisted the urge. This was a hurdle that only Mr. Yi could overcome by himself. No one else could help him. For the first time, he knew what a man was like when he was in despair. Rather than saying that Yi Muyun was a career-ambitious person, it would be more accurate to say that everything he had done since he was 10 years old was because of a girl named Tang Cher. Now, all his faith had collapsed. Where should he go? Gu Zei's face was blank. He thought of Qin Mu. Perhaps Qin Mu's love for Zhou Chongwang, Gu Mei's love for Zhou Chongwang, or Zhou Chongwang's love for Cher, were not even 1/10 as persistent as Yi Muyun's love for Cher. Excessive stubbornness would only hurt oneself. Chapter 2247. Guze couldn't tell how he had changed. He just felt that he was different. Check the Lan family situation. Yi Muyun looked at Guze. Didn't you say that Lan Yu is the eldest son of the Lan family? I think if something happens to the Grand Hyatt, he probably won't sit back and do nothing. Guze narrowed his eyes. The Grand Hyatt was the largest hotel chain in the country. There were more than 200 five-star hotels all over the country, and Lan Yu was the only heir. However, he had been hiding in New York all these years, for unknown reasons. Guze hesitated for a moment and finally nodded. Got it. He roughly understood what Mr. Yi meant. But would Cher agree to Mr. Yi doing this? The situation in Boyi was a bit complicated. Mr. Tang Yu had 40% of the shares. 20% had been transferred to Cher, and the other 20% had been transferred to Mr. Yi a few years ago. At that time, everyone thought that President Tang meant for Mr. Yi to wait, but looking at the situation today, this 20% was compensation. 5 years ago, Cher and Lan Yu had gotten married. Guze's heart turned cold when he thought about it. This battle wasn't between Lan Yu and Mr. Yi, but between Mr. Yi and Cher. When the time came, it would probably involve forcing the Lan family to abdicate. It was obvious that Mr. Yi wanted to do this. Guze had a premonition, Boyi was going to change. And he hadn't thought about picking a side. No matter what the result was, he thought that he would still stand by Mr. Yi's side. He didn't think about winning or losing anything, because that was how he had been all these years. In just a few short minutes, Guze's heart had already gone through 1,000 thoughts. When he stepped out of Pei Garden, he raised his head to look at the blazing sun above his head and smiled faintly. In the villa, Yi Muyun picked up the photos one by one, forming a thick stack. He found a pair of scissors and cut the photos of her and Lan Yu one by one. Her photo remained, while Lan Yu's, he put it in the ashtray and lit it with a lighter. In the light of the fire, his face seemed especially unfathomable. The next day, Yi Muyun went to Boyi. Over the next few days, he received several important shareholders. Each meeting lasted more than 4 hours. This was definitely not normal. Boye's employees began to feel uneasy. These business elites were all thousand-year-old foxes. Their sense of smell was as sensitive as animals before a catastrophe. The first to feel that something was wrong was Xiao Ran. As a senior member of the company, she was no longer a secretary but managed the HR department. However, she knew the movements of the company like the back of her hand. She had watched Yi Muyun grow up, and she had also heard about the explosive news these days. She knew that if Yi Muyun wanted to do something, even the gods couldn't stop him. She wasn't sure if Tang Yu had thought that this day would come, or if he had been too confident in Yi Muyun. But when it came to share, Yi Muyun would throw away all his beliefs. Mr. Tang couldn't be unaware of this, but why did he still do it? Xiao Ran still called Tang Yu, who was far away abroad. After the call, she slowly put down her phone, looking a little confused. She never thought that Tang Yu would think this way. Since he had predicted it, why did he do it? Chapter 22:48. Cher stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the hotel, looking down at the night view of B City. Lan Yu stood behind her and said gently, "It seems that you haven't painted for a long time. You once said that creating can make you calm down." Cher was still standing. She looked at the neon lights outside and said softly, "Lan Yu, after I painted that rainy night, I thought I had let go of it." She turned around slowly and looked at him. "So, I didn't." His brows furrowed. His voice was flat, but there was a hint of hoarseness that was hard to detect. "Ann, do you want to go back to him?" Snow's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unmoving. Lan Yu smiled gently and reached out to stroke her hair. She didn't move at all. After a long time, she said carefully, "I want to go back to New York." Lan Yu's expression became gentler and he smiled. "We'll go back soon." He walked forward and looked at the night view of B City with her. After a while, he suddenly turned his head and said, "Go home with me tomorrow." "Go home?" Cher was a little stunned. Lan Yu laughed lightly. "Is it strange? I didn't jump out of a rock." Cher still looked at him in confusion. She didn't understand why he hadn't gone home after so many years. Lan Yu looked at her and smiled lightly. He reached out and touched her little head. "Okay, go to bed early." Cher turned her little face and looked at him. "Okay, you go to bed early too." However, Lan Yu didn't leave immediately. His dark eyes were fixed on her, and under the chandelier, they seemed to be shining. For some reason, Cher's heart skipped a beat and she looked at him almost helplessly. Lan Yu went forward and stood very close to her. He could trap her in his arms if he stretched out his hand. He lowered his head and his thin lips were very close to her ear. He almost whispered, "Have you never thought about being with me for real?" Cher looked up and stared at him for a long time without saying a word. Lan Yu looked at her and smiled. "Are you scared?" He said lightly, "I'm joking." "A little." She said honestly, "I thought you only needed a little nanny to take care of the child." There was a trace of a smile in Lan Yu's eyes. "I seem to be taking care of you too." She took care of the child. She could only play with the child. He took care of the other household matters. Cher blushed. She had to admit that she had taken advantage of Lan Yu by marrying him. He provided her with food and lodging, and even gave her a son to play with. But she really loved Ishu. She also knew that Lan Yu would not give Ishu to her if she asked for a divorce. Ishu was his son, not hers. Between Ishu and Yi Muyun, she instinctively chose Ishu. After a long time, she couldn't help but think that perhaps this was motherly instinct. Or perhaps she could feel that Ishu had a blood connection that she couldn't bear to part with. Lan Yu didn't say anything else and just told her to go to bed early. Cher grunted in acknowledgement. I'd like to draw a sketch later. He looked at her, and his gaze was very profound under the lights. After a long time, he smiled and left. Cher stood for a long time, walked to the sofa and picked up the sketchbook. She hadn't done a sketch for a long time. It seemed to be 8 years. She vaguely remembered, but she just didn't want to pick it up. Chapter 2249. She was drawing Yimuyun. She wanted to stop, but she couldn't stop the pen in her hand. Every stroke reminded her of the time when she was young, when she would lie on the table and draw him every day. After so many years, she still remembered how he looked when he was young. When she finished the last stroke, a teardrop fell on the paper, blurring the lines and blurring her eyes. Cher closed her eyes and covered them with her hand. She seemed to have returned to the past and became that little girl again. Back then, she had an older brother, but now, she didn't. She had completely lost him. What caused her to lose him? Was it Qin Mu and Zhou Chongwang? Or was it because of her illness from the serious injury? She almost couldn't survive that illness. Ishu's appearance allowed her to survive, but it also caused her to lose Yimuyun forever. She curled up and cried, thinking that she was too greedy, so she hurt him. She cried herself to sleep, clutching the sketch tightly in her fingers. Late at night, Lan Yu quietly walked out of the guest room. He walked to the sofa and saw her curled up figure, as well as the tear stains on her face. Bending over, he took the sketch from her fingertips. Unsurprisingly, he saw a handsome face in high spirits on it. The 20-year-old Yimuyun. Lan Yu's unfathomable eyes carried a touch of coldness. He looked at it quietly, and a faint smile floated on his lips. The 20-year-old Yimuyun was enough to make every young girl fall in love with him. Indeed, he had the capital. However, he had only ever seen Tang Shui. No one else. Lan Yu's eyes were cold. After a long time, he placed the paper on the table and bent down to touch Cher's lips. His voice was gentle. It's been so long, and you still haven't forgotten him. Cher was in a deep sleep and didn't wake up. He kissed away her tears bit by bit and murmured, "Good night," and there was an indescribable gentleness in his eyes, but the gentleness was fleeting, as if he was looking at someone else through Cher. There were too many secrets hidden in Lan Yu's eyes. He straightened his body, reached out to carry her horizontally, and walked towards the master bedroom. When she and Ishu lay side by side, Xiao Ishu immediately rolled into her arms and hugged her like a little pig. Lan Yu's eyes were filled with warmth. He lowered his head and kissed each of their foreheads before leaving the room. He did not sleep. Instead, he smoked for half the night in the living room. He looked at the dark night outside, and his gaze was slightly tense. After 5 years, he had finally waited for this day. However, he was not as ecstatic as he thought he would be. It seemed that something had deviated from the track. He had become, as if he cared too much. Lan Yu stood there for the whole night, and it was not until the next morning that he washed away the smell of cigarettes and woke the two of them up. The darkness from last night was long gone, and he was back to being the gentle Lan Yu. Cher watched as he carried Xiao Ishu to brush her teeth. She scratched her hair and woke up. Suddenly, she recalled something, and her expression changed slightly. She shouted in the direction of the bathroom, "Lan Yu, were you the one who carried me back to the bedroom?" She held her breath after she asked that question. About 10 seconds later, he replied, "Yes, don't fall asleep on the sofa next time." His tone was indifferent, as if there was nothing to be unhappy about. Chapter 2250. Meanwhile, Cher ran into the living room and saw the painting she had drawn lying on the table. She picked it up and was about to throw it away when Lan Yu leaned against the door and said calmly, "Why do you want to throw it away? It's a good painting." Snow abruptly raised her head to look at him. Then, she coughed awkwardly, "I'm not too satisfied. The lines are smooth. Have you painted it many times?" His tone was still calm, as if he was discussing it with her in the past, without any personal feelings. Cher pursed her lips and flattened the painting with her fingers. She looked down and said, "I won't paint it again in the future." Lan Yu didn't say anything else and went back to the bathroom to brush his son's teeth. She knew that he wasn't satisfied with her performance. He told her that they could be husband and wife in name only and she could leave. But she couldn't be half-hearted in a marriage. Cher shook her head and threw the painting away in the end. She looked at it for a while when she threw it into the trash can and her eyes were a little wet. Lan Yu took her and Xiao Yishu back to the Lan family. Contrary to what she thought, the Lan family wasn't a scholarly family but a business family. The famous Grand Hyatt Hotel was actually owned by the Lan family. Lan Yu's parents were also very easygoing. They must have known about Cher and Xiao Yishu's appearance, so they didn't look surprised and even gave them a generous gift. Cher accepted it with a guilty conscience. She looked up at Lan Yu, who was playing chess with Mr. Lan. He looked at her calmly and said, "Since Mom gave it to you, just accept it." Cher said, "Oh," and accepted the gift. In order to welcome them back, Mrs. Lan cooked in person. Cher couldn't just sit there and do nothing, so she immediately ran over to help. Father Lan gave birth to a son and smiled lightly. "The person you've chosen isn't bad." Lan Yu looked in the direction of the kitchen and smiled. "You're so stupid. It's good that Mom isn't angry." Father Lan remained calm and composed. "It's been so many years. You only brought the child home when she's already so big. Lan Yu, don't you think too highly of her? Furthermore, she's still a daughter of the Tang family." Mr. Lan then asked meaningfully, "Don't you care about power?" Lan Yu raised his eyebrows and looked at his father with an indecipherable look. Man and power, Yi Muyun wants the same. Mr. Lan was also a veteran in the business field, so he said with certainty. Lan Yu was non-committal. Dad, Lan continued, "I've heard rumors about Boyi. Lan Yu, are you sure you want to get involved?" Lan Yu looked up. "Dad, do you want me to get involved? If you don't care, Cher doesn't care about Boyi, and we don't care about material things, you don't have to get involved." Mr. Lan made it clear. The marriage was a done deal. The child was already so big. What else could he do? Moreover, his grandson was so cute. How could Mr. Lan give up? Lan Yu pursed his lips and looked at his father. After a long time, he said calmly, "I know. I'll do my best." Getting Boyi was the first step. The second step was probably to deal with the Lan family. The third step was to force Lan Yu to give up his wife. That was probably Yi Muyun's plan. Mr. Lan nodded in agreement. "It's good that you're open-minded." Chapter 2251. While the father and son of the Lan family were chatting, there was a disaster in the kitchen. Cher had never done any housework, and she didn't want to appear incompetent in front of her mother-in-law, so she put in a lot of effort and even helped Xiao Yishu. It was a disaster for the mother and son to be together. Madame Lan held her forehead and didn't know what to say. Cher stared blankly at the pea-sized potato, then carefully looked at Madame Lan. She bit her lip and said a little embarrassedly, "This can be cooked, right?" Madame Lan's face twitched. It was rare for her to smile so lovingly. "They're so cute." Cher lowered her head even more, and then she covered her eyes with a pair of chubby hands. Xiao Yishu said in a childish voice, "Mommy likes cute things the most." Lan Yishu. Cher glared at the little girl. Xiao Yishu threw herself into Madame Lan's arms, and she immediately became a drama queen. "Grandma, Mommy is bullying me." Madame Lan smiled and patted her. "Grandma is here. Mommy wouldn't dare." Cher looked at her and peeled another bowl of potatoes and soybeans. Madame Lan looked at her and sighed. No wonder Lan Yu liked her and wanted to marry her. She was the one who gave birth to Lan Yu, and she knew his character very well. He had always been cold. It wasn't that he hadn't been pursued by good-looking ladies, and he had dated women before, but they didn't last long. On the other hand, he had always doted on his sister, Lan Ting. But when she thought of Lan Ting, Madame Lan felt sad. If she hadn't sent Lan Ting abroad, Lan Ting wouldn't have been in trouble. She would still be alive and well, and she would still be as innocent and cute as Cher. She was really afraid that Lan Yu loved Cher as Ting, and he didn't really like her. As Madame Lan thought about this, she couldn't help but feel a little sad. However, she soon let it go. It had been so many years, and it was time to let go of everything. Lan Yu should have let go of everything as well. She looked at Cher with a loving gaze. Besides, Xiao Yishu was so cute. Although he was a little boy, he was simply a replica of Cher. Madame Lan didn't doubt their relationship at all because Yishu and Cher looked alike. After dinner, Cher went out with Madame Lan to socialize. She introduced Cher to Madame Lan's old friends, but the main point was that Madame Lan brought her precious grandson to show off. After a few rounds of afternoon tea, Cher and Xiao Yishu returned to the Lan family with round bellies. Madame Lan was in an extremely good mood. Who said that their Lan Yu wasn't interested in women? Who said that artists were weird? Who said that he only liked men? Now, his little wife was even more beautiful than anyone else's. Madame Lan was very happy. She had a lot of words to share with her Lao Lan. Besides, she was a little reluctant to part with her grandson, so she asked Lan Yu and Cher to stay in the old house for one night with the child. Lan Yu didn't refuse. Cher naturally couldn't say anything. However, she didn't expect that Madame Lan would carry Xiao Yishu to their bedroom to sleep, saying that she wanted to tell her grandson a story. Cher didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but she had no choice but to stay. At 9:00 in the evening, she stood in the bedroom with Lan Yu. She bit her finger. Bed or sofa? Lan Yu glanced at her and walked to the bathroom. The bed is very big. It's enough for 2 people to sleep in. Lan Yu. She called softly behind him. He looked back at her. Chapter 2252. Lan Yu's gaze was unfathomable. After looking at her for a moment, he said calmly, "I won't touch you. Don't worry." He said it so bluntly that Cher's face heated up. Oh. She couldn't reject him like that. If she insisted, it would seem as though she had a guilty conscience. She watched as Lan Yu entered the bathroom. She turned back to look at the bedroom. It was a typical male bedroom with a dark gray color scheme. It should be where Lan Yu used to live. She wasn't used to it because it was filled with Lan Yu's scent. She had lived with him for 5 to 6 years, but she still felt a little unfamiliar with him. She couldn't quite imagine sleeping on his bed. She thought she would lose sleep. Lan Yu showered for about 10 minutes before walking out in a white bathrobe. She had to admit that he was a very good-looking man. Sometimes, she couldn't figure out if there was something wrong with his body that was why he was willing to stay in a marriage that was in name but not in reality. Perhaps his heart had been broken by a woman. What are you thinking about? Lan Yu looked over indifferently. Go take a shower. It's getting late. Oh, Cher replied and immediately ran in as though she was escaping. Lon Ute stood behind her. His gaze was deep and unfathomable. Cher ran into the bathroom and shut herself in immediately. Her heart was heaving up and down violently. She didn't know why, but she was a little afraid of Lon Ute now. She felt that he was a little different from before. His gaze often made her feel a sense of predation. He wasn't as innocent as before. When she soaked in the warm water, the anxiety in her heart was soothed. But then, she wanted to go berserk again. Because she had forgotten to take her clothes. The clothes she had changed out of were already soaked in water and couldn't be worn anymore. Cher wanted to cry. She grabbed her half-dry hair. Why was she so stupid? After showering, she wrapped herself in a towel and carefully opened a gap in the door. She called out to Lon Ute, "Do you have any clothes to change into?" Lon Ute was sitting on the sofa, working on his laptop. When he heard her voice, he looked up with a deep gaze. Then he smiled, walked into the changing room, took out a shirt, and handed it to her. "Just put it on." Cher took it and swallowed. "Aren't you going to give me a pair of pants?" Lon Ute's gaze was a little deep. "Just make do with it and wear it as pajamas." After Cher put it on, it was indeed up to her knees. Everything that should be covered was covered. Relieved, she opened the door and walked out. Lon Ute seemed to have finished his work. He walked over and handed her a glass of milk. "Drink some milk and go to bed early." Cher took it and looked at his indifferent expression. She also relaxed. Lon Ute wasn't any different from before. She was probably thinking too much. So she drank the glass of milk and nodded. "Then I'll go to bed first. Don't stay up too late." It was a little uncomfortable to lie in the same bed, so she asked him to sleep a little later. Half an hour later, Lon Ute looked at the little pig that had fallen asleep. His gaze became deep. She was wearing his white shirt and lying on his bed. She was stunningly beautiful, like the most beautiful painting. He knew that she had never fallen in love with him. At most, she only saw him as family. And recently, she must have felt uneasy in her heart. She was more perceptive than him. Chapter 22:53. Lon Ute's gaze was deep as he looked at Cher's quiet little face. He knew that she wouldn't wake up no matter what he did. There were 2 sleeping pills in that glass of milk. It was enough for her to sleep until noon the next day. He held her with one hand and took his phone with the other. He adjusted the angle and took a few photos. After that, he took a few photos of her alone. Those photos were very aesthetically pleasing. After all, Lon Ute was an artist and had a certain sense of beauty. Especially when Cher was lying on the dark-colored bedsheets with her body turned sideways and only wearing a shirt. Her tender look made Lon Ute unable to take his eyes off her. He had always known that she was a beautiful person. However, after 5 years, it wasn't that he didn't have any desire for her. It was just that it was very, very little. Even if there was a little, he would suppress it. At this moment, facing such a seductive photo, he wouldn't be a man if he didn't have any reaction. His slender fingers touched her face, but he retracted them abruptly. Lon Ute's face was filled with depression. In the end, he fled and solved it himself in the bathroom. When Cher woke up and opened her eyes, it was almost noon. Naturally, Lon Ute wasn't in the room anymore. She looked around and finally reached out to block the sunlight and stretched. She was so tired. It was as if she had been working for a few days and nights. Even now, her body was very tired. She sat up and realized that there was a paper bag beside the bed. It was a brand that she often wore. She reached out to take it and flipped through it. A set of clothes was neatly prepared. This brand of clothes was quite expensive. At least, it wasn't something that the little artist, could afford. However, for the past few years, Lanyu had taken good care of her and provided her with the same lifestyle as before. Sometimes, she really couldn't understand why he didn't find a woman who was willing to serve him wholeheartedly when he had so much money. It was enough for her to kneel down and lick him. She had asked him before, and he said it was because Xiao Yishu liked her. Therefore, in Lanyu's place, Cher positioned herself as a top-notch nanny, and she enjoyed his top-notch care with a peace of mind. She changed her clothes, washed her face, and went downstairs. She felt a little guilty, because this was the first time she spent the night in the Lan family's house, and she slept until noon. Although she was a fake wife, she couldn't lose face for Lanyu. She tiptoed downstairs. The villa was so quiet that there was almost no sound. Just as she was relaxing, Lanyu's voice suddenly sounded, "You're awake." Cher was startled. She nodded and looked around. "Where's Yishu?" Lanyu sat on the sofa and seemed to be drawing something in a sketchbook. He looked up and said, "My mom took him to a social gathering." As a grandmother, she would never complain that her grandson did not have enough appearances. Yesterday, he had only seen 3 groups of old sisters. How was that enough? The moment Cher heard that, she let out a long sigh. "Yishu, it's been hard on you." Lanyu lowered his head and drew a few more random strokes before closing the notebook. Looking at the clothes she had changed into, he said calmly, "The servants at home are on vacation. What do you want to eat later?" Cher's eyes widened. Why are they on vacation? She was a little puzzled. Today wasn't some festival. Lanyu walked closer slowly and looked at her. He smiled. "My mom said that she wants to have a grandchild and rule the world." Cher couldn't help but burst out laughing. "I'm dying of laughter. Lanyu, your mom has a much better sense of humor than you. Do you think that I'm boring?" Lanyu asked suddenly. Chapter 2254. What about Yi Muyun? He asked in surprise. She wasn't the only one who was surprised. He was surprised too. His question was full of jealousy, and it couldn't be more obvious. Cher pursed her lips and smiled faintly. "It's been too long. I've forgotten." With that, she walked out of the door. "Didn't you say we were going out for dinner? I'm a little hungry." Her attitude showed that she didn't want to talk about Yi Muyun. And the more she tried to avoid it, the more she cared about it. Lanyu reached out to hold her. When she turned back, he could see the anger in her eyes clearly. In her heart, she was still in love with that man, and he could see it clearly. And she had hidden this feeling in her heart. She had made up her mind to be a fake couple with him for the rest of her life, right? Lanyu's eyes were burning with a small flame, but he hid it instantly. He looked down and said faintly, "I'm going up to change." Cher heaved a sigh of relief. "I'll wait for you here." She sat on the sofa, picked up his sketchbook, and flipped through it. Lanyu walked upstairs. His gaze swept past her, and he didn't say anything. He just slowly went upstairs. Cher sat and flipped to the page of his drawing. She was a little surprised. She looked up, but she couldn't see Lanyu. He had gone upstairs to change. Her gaze fell back to the drawing. After looking at it for a long time, she chose not to say anything and put the sketchbook down. It was just that her heart was pounding, as if she had peeped into his heart. Or did he let her see it on purpose? She wasn't sure, so she didn't make a sound when she got into his car. She also didn't realize that they were wearing the same color today, which could be said to be a couple's outfit. Lanyu held the steering wheel and asked casually, "Where do you want to eat?" "You decide." Cher said a little absent-mindedly. Lanyu smiled. I know a good restaurant. Snow grunted in acknowledgement. Her current mood was that it didn't matter where she ate. But she didn't expect that Lan Yu would take her to the restaurant opened by Zhao Yan. Zhao Yan was also there, but he didn't play. Instead, he leaned against the bar counter and chatted with Qin Mu. Qin Mu lived with Zhou Chongguang, but she was still very close to Zhao Yan. Because of this, Zhou Chongguang was quite annoyed. Did he not know how to play the piano? Why did she always come out to listen to Zhao Yan play? Zhao Zi said something very painful, because Zhao Yan plays better than you. After that, Zhou Zong began to practice the zither day after day, but Qin Mu still didn't pay attention to him. She still ran outside all day and hung out with Zhao Yan. At this moment, when she saw Cher coming over with Lan Yu, she couldn't help but be a little stunned. After a while, she said softly, "Zhao Yan, you knew about it, didn't you?" She felt quite complicated. Cher came back and lived with her brother, and even had sex with him. She thought that they had a good chance of being together. After all, her brother and Song Karen had broken up, hadn't they? Zhao Yan smiled. "No, I don't. No, I never knew about it. I only found out recently, not earlier than you guys. Even, my brother, Tang Yu, didn't know about it." When he said that Tang Yu was his brother, he was still a little embarrassed. The age difference was too big. To Zhao Yan, Tang Yu wasn't just a brother, he was like a father. Chapter 2255. When Cher saw Qin Mu, she was a little surprised. Because when Qin Mu and Zhao Yan were together, they didn't have any taboos. Did something happen between her and Zhao Yan? If something really happened between them, she would have to call Qin Mu auntie in the future. How messy. However, Cher couldn't care less about that. She just smiled faintly and walked in with Lan Yu. They picked a seat and sat down. Holding her chin, she looked at the menu and asked Lan Yu, "How did you know about this restaurant?" Lan Yu smiled. "It was reported in the New York Times. Don't forget that your uncle is also a celebrity." Cher looked up and said, "Oh," but she didn't say anything else. After she ordered, Lan Yu went to the restroom. When he came back, Qin Mu was already sitting at their table. Lan Yu smiled faintly and bent down to kiss Cher on the forehead. "Can you introduce me?" Cher looked up. She had placed all of her attention on her forehead. The warmth made her feel a little uneasy. She didn't know why Lan Yu would do that. She was stunned. Then, Lan Yu reached out and touched her gently. "Cher." Cher came back to her senses and introduced uncomfortably, "This is Qin Mu, my childhood playmate." Before she could continue, Lan Yu had already introduced himself. "I'm Lan Yu, Ann's husband. We've been married for 5 years." Qin Mu took in a deep breath, while Shua was in a sorry state. Lan Yu smiled. "Since you are Cher's friend, why don't we share a table and invite Zhao Yan?" He asked Cher in a very gentle manner, just like a gentle husband. Cher wouldn't embarrass him in such an occasion. Moreover, he really didn't do anything out of line, so she couldn't reject him. But she also knew that the atmosphere Lan Yu created was that of a loving couple. She didn't know if he was doing it on purpose, but she felt uncomfortable and depressed. Qin Mu was also a little uncomfortable. Even if she wanted to move, she would lose her composure. She could only look at Zhao Yan and smile helplessly. Zhao Yan's position was different from hers, because he was Cher's uncle. Now that the rice was cooked, and the child was already 5 years old, he had to accept the truth. Everyone had to accept it, including Yi Muyun. However, Zhao Yan's inner monologue was like this: "I really didn't expect that I would underestimate her. She actually dared to play outside of marriage, and the other party was even Yi Muyun. The high and mighty Mr. Yi. When Mr. Yi saw her return and sent Song Karen flying, he probably wanted to strangle her to death when he found out that Cher was married. Zhao Yan smiled mysteriously and occasionally looked at Qin Mu. Qin Mu couldn't stay calm. Everyone knew what she was thinking, otherwise she wouldn't stay by Zhou Chongwang's side with peace of mind. Qin Mu kept a straight face and looked at Cher and Lan Yu, trying to find something. But in the end, she could only come to one conclusion, and that was that Lan Yu was the perfect husband. She was a little desperate. Her brother was probably finished. There was no hope. Think about it, her brother was so fierce to Cher, but in comparison, Lan Yu was much more considerate and respectful. After the meal, Qin Mu left first, feeling a little confused. Zhao Yan saw that she was a little uneasy, so he finally decided to send her back. In the car, Qin Mu held her forehead with her fingers and said softly, "Zhao Yan, take me home." Zhao Yan nodded. Chapter 2256. Zhao Yan smiled and gave her a tissue. "Qin Mu, you look like you're going to cry." Qin Mu looked a little embarrassed and turned her face away. Zhao Yan smiled again. "Actually, everyone is fine. It's just that you can't let it go." He held the steering wheel with his long fingers and focused on driving, but his voice was unbelievably gentle. "It's been so many years. You've punished yourself enough. Don't live for others anymore." Qin Mu didn't say anything. She even held her breath and looked at him. Zhao Yan reached out and ruffled her hair. "Silly, whether you and Zhou Chongwang are together or not doesn't affect your brother and Cher. You can choose the path you want to take." He snorted. "For example, go to New York with me. I can play the piano for you for a long time." He said it very casually, but Qin Mu was stunned. She and Zhao Yan had always been friends, and she had never had that kind of thought. Now that he said it, she was shocked and surprised. She felt sorry for him because she really didn't have any other feelings. She didn't say anything. Zhao Yan smiled. "I'm joking with you." As for whether it was a joke or not, she didn't know, but she was relieved to be able to get out of this embarrassing situation. Zhao Yan said a few more words to tease her, and the atmosphere eased up. When the car stopped at the Qin family's house, Zhao Yan stopped the car and looked at Qin Mu. "It was just a joke." "Qin Mu, when Guzhe said this to you, what were your thoughts?" Qin Mu looked at him in surprise, not knowing how he knew. Zhao Yan smiled. "When you were at the beach with him, I was behind a rock." Qin Mu's face darkened. Only then did she know that Zhao Yan had been making fun of her today. She pinched him and got out of the car. Zhao Yan also got out, smiling. However, the two little ones soon stopped smiling because Zhou Chongwang was also at the Qin family's house. He was glaring at them as if there was grass growing on his hair. Zhao Yan smiled, opened the car door, got into the car and drove away. To be honest, that smile was quite provocative. At least in Zhou Chongwang's eyes. When the car drove away, his face was burning as he looked at Qin Mu. "Can you explain?" "Explain what?" "Explain that I cheated on you." Qin Mu was in a bad mood and she didn't take him seriously, so she didn't hold back. She even hit him with her bag. Zhou Chongwang was stunned for a moment. He then followed behind her and quickly grabbed her little hand. "Qin Mu, speak clearly." Qin Mu stopped in his tracks and smiled calmly. "All right, speak clearly. Let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau and clarify things." "What do you think, Director Zhou?" "Even if it is, it's Zhong, and I meant a Zhong, a married woman." Qin Mu. Qin Mu sneered, "Even if it's a lie, it's me, an unmarried woman, who takes advantage of you. Zhou Chongguang was humiliated, but he still endured it. After all, this was the Qin family. He coughed lightly. Moo, Mom and I made dumplings together. Do you want to eat some? I've eaten with Zhao Yan. She seemed to be deliberately angering him. She tried to break free, but Zhou Chongguang's grip was firm. His eyes were deep. Then eat with me. Chapter 2257. After she said that, Zhou Chongguang stopped in his tracks. Qin Mu, you also know that I pester you all day. She wanted to take a step back, but he pulled her forward again, almost sticking to his body. Do you think that I have nothing to do all day, so I wander around in front of you? You did it willingly. Qin Mu was not a naive girl. She was easily fooled by him and said unhappily. Zhou Chongguang reached out and pulled her into his arms. She raised her head and pressed it against his chin. Yes, I did it willingly. But Mrs. Zhou is always around Zhao Yan all day. Isn't that right? His eyes were quite stern. Qin Mu bit her lip. No. He glared at her fiercely. He confessed to you and is going to take you to New York, isn't he? Qin Mu did not say anything. She stared at Zhou Chongguang in a daze. How did he guess it? She did not speak, but in his heart, she tacitly agreed. He couldn't help but be furious, but he suppressed his temper. We are not divorced yet. Qin Mu glanced at him. She found that he was angry, so she was happy. We will be divorced soon. She wanted to annoy him. Zhou Chongguang narrowed his eyes and looked at the ridiculous apron he was wearing. Because of her, he never appeared in any entertainment venues again. He threw all those small celebrities and models to the back of his mind. He followed her around every day and sucked up to his mother-in-law. What was it for? Probably because she saw his anger. Qin Mu's tone was very indifferent. Zhou Chongguang, what I did in the past was far better than what you did, but you still did not look at me. You played what you should and shouldn't play with. And I was just eating and chatting with a friend. It didn't bother you. After she said that, she pushed him away and walked to the main house. Zhou Chongguang was originally furious, but after carefully thinking about her words, it seemed like she was clarifying that there was nothing between her and Zhao Yan, so he couldn't help but lightly smile. Zhou Chongguang didn't know what was going on with him either. In short, ever since Qin Mu wanted to divorce him, there were a lot of peach blossoms around her. Forget about Gu Zhe, even Zhao Zi said that he liked Qin Mu. There was also Zhao Yan. He always felt that this guy was always so free with Qin Mu. Who the hell did Zhao Yan attend the last reality show for? God knows. Zhou Zong thought about it and became angry again. He took off his apron and followed Qin Mu in. Qin Mu and Yi Liangqiu were sitting on the sofa. Zhou Chongguang could be insolent in front of anyone because he had fallen out with them in the past. However, Yi Liangqiu was the only one whom he had some respect for. Seeing that both mother and daughter were silent, he pursed his lips. I'll head to the dining room first then. He looked at Qin Mu, hinting that they would head home after they were done eating. Qin Mu ignored him and continued talking to her mother, talking about her brother and Cher. She could tell that for the past few years, other than her brother, there was her mother as well. Her mother had always been feeling guilty. Even if she didn't say it, Qin Mu knew that her mother was longing for Cher to return. She longed for redemption. But this time around, her mother was going to be disappointed. Qin Mu couldn't bear to hear that, so she told the truth. Mummy, I bumped into Cher and that Lan Yu in the dining room. Yi Liangqiu sighed out. What sort of person is he? Chapter 2258. He's from a good family. Yi Liangqiu forced a smile. What about your brother? He's not going to fight with anyone, is he? Everyone was surprised by Lan Yu's sudden change. After all, Yi Liangqiu had heard from Qin Mu that Cher and Yi Muyun had a relationship. Yi Liangqiu didn't understand, and neither did Qin Mu. The mother and daughter sat quietly for a long time. Yi Liangqiu patted the back of Qin Mu's hand. Go and eat some dumplings. Zhou Chongwang has been busy making them all morning. Qin Mu didn't say anything. Yi Liangqiu said calmly, if it's about the past, you don't have to. The important thing is whether you want to divorce him now, or whether you want to live with him. Mom. Qin Mu couldn't help saying softly, I haven't thought about it yet. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and patted her hand again. Then think about it slowly. There's no rush to make a decision. She got up to eat the dumplings and Qin Mu accompanied her. When Zhou Chongwang was done, he attentively brought the dumplings over to Yi Liangqiu. He even specially used a small bowl to fill for dumplings for Qin Mu. Qin Mu didn't have enough for lunch, so she reluctantly ate a few dumplings. After eating, Yi Liangqiu sent the couple away, saying that she wanted to take a nap and couldn't accompany them. Zhou Chongwang naturally couldn't ask for more. Qin Mu didn't want to disturb her mother, so she left with Zhou Chongwang. In the car, he tilted his head and asked her, what are you thinking about? About your brother. Qin Mu was supporting her chin. Hearing his words, she quickly glanced at him. Zhou Chongwang saw that her eyes were a little red. He didn't say anything more and just ruffled her hair. Qin Mu turned her face away and looked out of the car window. It wasn't until the car drove back to the house in Qingshui Road that Qin Mu asked him in a low voice, Zhou Chongwang, if my brother and the Tang family really reach that stage, will you help him or step on them and benefit from it? Zhou Chongwang looked at her in surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to ask this. He smiled, slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, and said slowly, my biggest benefit now is you, Qin Mu. What do you want me to do? Qin Mu pursed her lips and said nothing. Zhou Chongwang's smile deepened. You don't dare to say it. Are you afraid that I will make some improper requests? Zhou Chongwang, that's enough. Qin Mu bit her lips and glared at him. He pinched her chin. You're my wife. I won't go too far. His voice was very soft and hoarse. You know very well in your heart, don't you? As long as you stay by my side, I will unconditionally stand by your brother's side. With that, he opened the car door and got out of the car. Qin Mu followed him all the way upstairs. She was a little absent-minded. When she came back to her senses, she had already followed him to the study upstairs. This was the first time Qin Mu had come in. For a moment, she was a little stunned. His study was decorated very luxuriously. All the furniture was made of logs and pine, and there was a faint smell of wood. Qin Mu wanted to leave, but he stopped her. You can decide after reading this. Qin Mu frowned. Zhou Chongwang walked to the desk, took out a document from the drawer, and gently put it on the table. Mu, if you're willing to stay, this is yours. Qin Mu looked suspicious, but she still took a step forward and gently picked up the document. She was stunned after looking at it, 8% of Boyi's shares. Chapter 2259. Qin Mu knew that the market value of Glory Light was only 70 to 80 billion yuan. Seeing her surprised expression, Zhou Chongwang smiled. 8 years is enough for a person to do a lot of things. Qin Mu's expression suddenly changed. She stared at Zhou Chongwang. You've thought about Boyi before? Yes. Zhou Chongwang admitted it directly. But now I think that your brother and I are very close, and it seems like a good idea to support him. What do you think, Moo? Qin Moo's voice was tense. My brother may not go that far. He's already taken it. Zhou Chongguang's voice sounded a bit cold. You probably don't know this, but he already has 30% of the shares, and Tang Shui has 20%, but Zhao Yi has 15%. That is to say, Tang's share will still be the biggest shareholder, but if I help him, Boyi will change owners. This was a huge temptation for Qin Moo. She didn't mean that she wanted her brother to get Boyi. She just felt that if getting Boyi could change Cher's mind, she was willing to do anything. Of course, she knew that 8% wouldn't be easy to get. She wanted it now. Zhou Chongguang looked at Qin Moo. How could he not know what she was thinking? He had a faint smile on his face. Qin Moo, think about it carefully. Is it worth it for Yi Muyun's unknown future? Qin Moo's eyes were still on the document. She said softly, my brother gave up once for me. I can do it too. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the document and held it in her arms. At this moment, her heart was trembling, and her whole body was trembling. She looked at him and finally said slowly, I want it now. Zhou Chongguang looked into her eyes and smiled. He took out another document from the drawer. I think if you sign this, we will probably have a better time working together. It was a marital agreement. Qin Moo looked at it for a long time. She reached for it and read it page by page. At the end, she was a little surprised. The agreement was very simple and formulaic, but in the end, it was a handwritten guarantee from Zhou Chongguang. He guaranteed that he would play for Elise for Qin Moo once a day. He guaranteed that it would be fresh every day. He guaranteed that he would wake her up with a kiss every day, and he guaranteed that he would have sex with her more than 4 times a week. Qin Moo glared at him and continued reading. He promised to cook for Moo Moo every day. He promised that there would be no other women in the future. In the marriage between Zhou Chongguang and Qin Moo, there would be only the two of them. There would not be a third party. Of course, if Qin Moo cheated, he would kill the husband. At first, Qin Moo was a little touched, but in the end, she shouted, What do you mean by Qin Moo cheated? She squinted at him and said, Zhou Chongguang, do you mean that I will cheat on you? Zhou Chongguang held back his laughter and said, I mean if. He paused for a moment and looked at her meaningfully. Guzay, don't tell me that no one knows that you sat by the sea that night. Qin Moo snorted and ignored him. Zhou Chongguang walked around the desk, and hugged her from behind. His arms slowly tightened, and his hot face was buried in her neck. His voice was low and hoarse. Moo Moo, will you sign it? Chapter 2260. He sighed. I want you to sign it, but at the same time, I don't want you to sign it. Moo Moo, I hope you'll change your mind because you still love me and have confidence in me again, not because of this 8%, and I don't want you to feel that it's a sacrifice. Qin Moo's voice was a little faint. Then won't you be able to get the truth if you give it to me for free? Zhou Chongguang chuckled and bit her neck to vent his anger. You're getting naughtier and naughtier. But I can't sign it now, okay? Qin Moo bit her lip. I need to think about it. But he tightened his arms around her waist and said, Moo Moo, I want it now. Qin Moo turned her face away and wanted to talk to him, but before she could speak, her mouth was blocked. Then she was carried to the desk, and he stood in the middle of her body and leaned forward to kiss her. The agreement in her hand fell to the ground with a thud, and she came back to her senses. Focus. He bit her lips and said unhappily, Mrs. Zhou. Qin Moo struggled slightly. Zhou Chongguang, this is the study. She was not used to doing this, and she was not used to doing this kind of thing in such a place. Zhou Chongguang said in a low voice, "Do it here." His tone was a little domineering and did not allow her to refuse. Qin Mu resisted a little, but he was unable to resist. He was still pressed down on the desk and had another round of sex. When it ended, she lay in his arms and buried her face in his waist. She was crying because she had been bullied by him just now. Zhou Chongguang knew that he was a little rough. The way he had taken her just now was almost barbaric. He patted her shoulder and comforted her gently. "Okay, don't cry." But the more he comforted her, the more Qin Mu cried. She curled up in his arms like a little girl and cried miserably. Zhou Chongguang couldn't do anything to her, so he could only hug her and coax her. Qin Mu hugged him with one arm and stretched out her hand. "You signed the agreement." Zhou Chongguang didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He kissed her forehead in a low voice. "Just one time with you, and tens of billions are gone. What should I do if you still divorce me?" Because he hadn't left her yet. As he said this, he deliberately tormented her again. Qin Mu wailed. Her heart was trembling from his torture. She lay in his arms and hugged him tightly. Her voice was also soft. "Zhou Chongguang. Tell me, if you go away, what shall I do?" he began again. Qin Mu was afraid of him. Moreover, he had just done it. How could his stamina be so good? Qin Mu couldn't stand it anymore. She bit her lips and said with a trembling voice, "I'll sign, I'll sign." Although she said that, he still didn't let her go. He still burned her again. When Zhou Chongguang let go of her, Qin Mu felt that she was on the verge of death. She didn't know how she signed the agreement. She just wanted to sleep after signing it. Zhou Chongguang hugged her and whispered, "Go take a shower before you sleep." Qin Mu tried hard to open one eye and said in a weak voice, "No." She was afraid that he was going to do it again. But Zhou Chongguang smiled slightly. "Mu, I don't think we've taken a bath together." She actually felt that he wanted to say something else. She wanted to resist, but she couldn't, so she let him carry her into the bathroom. Chapter 2261. He leaned against the bed. His body was exhausted, but he didn't feel like sleeping. He looked down at the young lady in his arms. She was indeed a young lady, only 22 years old. After 4 years of marriage, she wanted a divorce. Were they reconciled now? Although he had used some underhanded means. However, Zhou Chongguang didn't have anything to regret. After all, to him, fame and fortune had already been achieved. If he wanted to win Qin Mu's heart, he had to let go of his hatred. He chose to let go because he didn't want to lose Qin Mu. In the past, he wasn't too obsessed with revenge. However, what he had done for the past 8 years, he had never thought that he could get her back today. It was a little expensive, but it was worth it. Zhou Chongguang's eyes darkened. His large palm gently caressed her waist. There should already be a child here. He noticed that these few days were Qin Mu's period. He was working so hard, so there was no reason why she couldn't get pregnant. Although she had signed the agreement, he didn't know if they would fight in the future. There was no difference between a separation and a divorce. If his wife wasn't in his own bed, would she still be his wife? Therefore, to Zhou Chongguang, a child was safer than the agreement. Because Qin Mu was such a kind girl, she wouldn't let the child be without a father. He lay down for a while, then got up and went downstairs to prepare dinner for her. The servants weren't around, so he was the only one left. When Qin Mu woke up, it was already 10 o'clock. There was a bedside lamp in the bedroom, and the light was warm. She sat up and looked at herself under the blanket. There was only a bathrobe, which must have been changed by Zhou Chongguang. Footsteps could be heard on the stairs. Qinmu burrowed into the blanket and buried her face. Soon, Zhou Chongwang appeared at the door. She rested her little face on her knees and looked at him carefully. She was a little stubborn and didn't make a sound. "Are you angry?" Zhou Chongwang smiled warmly. He walked over to sit by the bed and reached out to stroke her hair. "I've made dinner. Shall I carry you downstairs to eat?" Qinmu didn't say anything and just looked at him. "I promise that the 8% will be under your name tomorrow, okay?" His palm landed and pinched her chin. "Be good and eat." Qinmu looked at him and felt that he was a stranger. After all, he had treated her coldly for 8 years. Now, she was a little absent-minded. So this was how it felt to be pampered. But she wasn't sure if she liked it. At least, she couldn't let it go. Those injuries, those women, did not disappear from his memory just like that. Qinmu bit her lips and kept looking at him. She didn't even know how cute she was. Zhou Chongwang reached out to rub her hair and smiled. "Okay, I'll carry you downstairs." As he spoke, he dragged her out from under the blanket. Qinmu whimpered, "It hurts." He was stunned for a moment. Then, he saw the marks on her body. His eyes darkened as he asked softly, "Does it still hurt?" Afraid that she would fall, Qinmu hooked her arms around his neck and refused to look at him. She only nodded her head. Zhou Chongwang smiled and kissed her. "I won't be so rough in the future." Qinmu bit her lips and glared at him. But she didn't say anything in the end. Although there were only the two of them, Zhou Chongwang still made a table full of dishes. Qinmu looked at the time and guessed that he hadn't slept yet. After sitting down, she said softly, "Too much." Chapter 2262. Zhou Chongwang's voice carried a hint of a smile. "I'm afraid that I'm not good enough." After so many years, he didn't even know what she liked to eat. Hence, he cooked more and there would always be dishes that she liked to eat. Qinmu didn't know what he was thinking, but she was indeed hungry and tasted everything. He kept looking at her with a calm gaze. The meal was eaten in silence. After all, they weren't as intimate as an ordinary husband and wife, and there was always something between them. Zhou Chongwang didn't force her. Anyway, they had a generation of time, and they could take it slowly. After the meal, Zhou Chongwang was the one who cleaned up and washed the dishes. After washing, Qinmu sat on the sofa and said softly, "You don't have to do this for me. Let the servants at home go to work tomorrow." Zhou Chongwang smiled faintly. "But I gave them 3 days off." Qinmu looked at him for a long time, indicating that he was quite bored. Zhou Chongwang suddenly came over, reached out and carried her, and walked towards the piano by the floor-to-ceiling window. Qinmu struggled instinctively. "Zhou Chongwang, what do you want to do?" "Let go." He placed her beside him. Qinmu was really afraid of him, and she pursed her lips. "What do you want to do?" "Play the piano and make love." "You go first." He smiled, and it was a very hateful smile. Qinmu glared at him. "You're not going to choose." "If you're not going to choose, I'll choose." Zhou Chongwang pinched her nose. "You know which one I'll choose. Play the piano." Qinmu's voice was very fast. Zhou Chongwang chuckled and played a song according to her wishes. It was something Qinmu had never heard before. It was quite beautiful. After he finished playing, she tilted her head and asked him, "Why haven't I heard it before?" Zhou Chongwang put down his hands and turned his face to look at her seriously. Then, he cupped her face with both hands and kissed her. His voice was especially deep. "This is a song I wrote for you. I haven't thought of a name yet. How about calling it Annie Baby? Qin Mu's eyes fell on his face. After a while, she said, you can compose songs. Yes, but usually not. He smiled. Do you want to hear it again? Qin Mu leaned her head on his shoulder and said, go ahead. However, Qin Mu did not start immediately. Instead, she chased after her and kissed her lightly on the lips. She murmured, Mumu, I hope that one day you will be with me, not because of your brother's sacrifice. If you support him unconditionally now, it won't be a sacrifice for me. She smiled slightly. Zhou Chongwang, do you dare? Her smile was so bright and lively, it was something he had rarely seen. In the past, he had never thought that his wife was boring. She was clearly very interesting. Zhou Chongwang did not answer. Instead, he kissed her lips. After a long time, he said in a low voice, Mumu, I don't dare. Because he did not dare to waste the last chance. If she ran away, there was nothing he could do about her. He did not let go of her. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers and kissed her over and over again until her toes curled up. Zhou Chongwang was indulgent. Probably because she had been cold to him for too long, he did not let her go all night. In the past, this kind of thing between them was the traditional kind. Now, he suddenly let go, and Qin Mu could not bear it. Chapter 2263. At this time, B City was shrouded in smoke. Boyi was changing. The entire upper class of B City knew that Yi Muyun was going to force the Empress to abdicate. Boyi was divided into two groups. One group had no support. After all, Tang Yu was playing abroad and didn't want to go home, and Cher didn't want to make progress and wasn't cut out for business at all. The other group was Yi Muyun's loyal subordinates. But these people weren't the most important. The most important ones were the shareholders of Boyi. From the looks of it, Tang Cher had the upper hand in the shares, but she wasn't good at managing. Before she found someone who could replace Mr. Yi, Miss Tang had to listen to Yi Muyun on many things. Just when the storm was brewing, a stack of photos smeared a layer of ambiguity on the upper class. In fact, it wasn't embarrassing, because the male and female lead were married. To put it bluntly, they were husband and wife. But at the same time, the female lead was also the female lead in the drama of forcing the Empress to abdicate. This couldn't help but make people think too much. This time, was it Tang Cher's counterattack? One had to know that Mr. Yi loved Miss Tang to death. This time, Miss Tang couldn't fight him openly, so it was possible that she would use her feelings as a weapon in secret. The photos taken by Lan Yu, because he accidentally lost his phone when he went to the bathroom to eat in the restaurant. The photos of Cher that were taken by his phone made the entertainment headlines and caused a sensation for 3 consecutive days. Those photos weren't just of her, but also of her and Lan Yu. On the top floor of the Boyi office building, Yi Muyun was holding a newspaper in his hand and standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. He wore a pair of iron gray trousers with a dark blue shirt on top. He looked like a well-ironed elite. Behind him, Guze stood quietly with a solemn expression on his face. After a long time, he couldn't help but say quietly, Mr. Yi, it can't be Cher. She has no reason to do this. Guze clearly remembered the press conference that day. When Lan Yu appeared, Cher looked at Mr. Yi cautiously, like a child who had done something wrong. At that time, he couldn't bear to watch. The newspaper was torn into pieces between Yi Muyun's fingers, and the pieces fell to the ground one by one. It was a frightening sight. Yi Muyun suppressed his voice. Guze, she won't. But that guy called Lan Yu would. This was a provocation from Lan Yu. Yi Muyun turned his head slowly. Do you think Lan Yu loves her? If he loved someone, would he expose that person's body in front of the whole world like that? Although she was wearing a shirt, it was a man's deep-rooted bad habit to not want others to see his woman's body at all. Moreover, it was a bed photo like this. Guzay was silent for a while. He looked at Yi Muyun calmly. Mr. Yi, what about our plan? Continue with it. Yi Muyun turned his back and looked at the scenery outside. He said calmly, she's so silly, she needs someone to protect her. Even if it was a little intense, he still wanted to protect her for the rest of her life. Even if she was by someone else's side. These few days, he had been thinking that if they didn't have a child, would he impulsively tie her back to his side? Even if he had to make the whole world his enemy, he would force her to stay. But she and Lan Yu had a child, such an adorable child. When Yi Muyun said this, his voice sounded very tired. Guzay sighed softly, but he didn't say anything else. Before he left, all he could think about was that in this lifetime, Chairman Yi had lived entirely for Tang Shui. Chapter 2264. As the office door closed, Guzay bumped into Secretary Zhang Sini at the door. She was holding a cup of coffee and looked like she was about to go in. Guzay paused and smiled faintly. Secretary Zhang, the CEO is not in a good mood right now. It's better if you don't go in. Zhang Sini looked up and met Guzay's deep gaze. She smiled faintly and said, I think Mr. Yi needs a cup of coffee right now. It's useless. Guzay's tone became even more indifferent. All these years, do you know how many women who are younger and prettier than you are? Do you know how many of them have thrown themselves into Mr. Ye's arms? But Mr. Yi has never accepted them. Zhang Sini looked embarrassed that she had been exposed, but she quickly retorted, that's because Mr. Yi hasn't given up yet. Now that Tang Sher has a husband and a child, does Mr. Yi still need to keep his chastity for her? Guzay listened to her words and looked at her meaningfully. He simply said, you seem to be smarter than Song Karen. In fact, she was even dumber. Why could Song Karen become Mr. Ye's temporary girlfriend? It was because Song Karen was the same age as Cher, and her face somewhat resembled Cher. Did Zhang Sini not realize all this? Or perhaps she was pretending not to understand. Guzay didn't say anything else and quickly left, leaving Secretary Zhang standing outside the office with a cup of coffee in her hand. She was a little hesitant. But she didn't hesitate for too long. She pushed the door open and said with a decent smile, Mr. Yi. Get out. Yi Muyun wasn't as gentle to her as he was to Guzay. His attitude was unusually rude. The smile on Zhang Sini's face froze. She thought that no matter how indifferent he was to her, she was still an outstanding secretary and he would give her the respect she deserved. But at this moment, she was shocked by his brutality. He was no longer that noble young master, but an ordinary man trapped by love. Zhang Sini's eyes were brimming with tears. She revealed the fragility of a woman at the right time. Mr. Yi, you're the secretary. If you're not my personal relationship consultant, you can either resign or apply for a transfer. Do it today. Yi Muyun sounded a little impatient. Zhang Sini gasped. She could barely hold the cup of coffee in her hand. After a long while, she bit her lip and asked softly, is it true that other than Tang Sher, no one else has a place in your heart? Originally, he didn't want to answer her question, but Yi Muyun still answered, yes. Why? Zhang Sini seemed to be insulted and finally couldn't help getting excited. She's married. Didn't you see those photos? What she didn't say was that his woman had slept with someone else. When he missed her, she was lying under someone else's body, tossing and turning. Her excitement didn't bring her any substantial benefits. She was dismissed. Yi Muyun finally turned his head slowly and looked at Zheng Xini quietly. It was the first time in all these years that he looked at her so carefully. Without the naivety of her school days, she was undoubtedly beautiful. It was this beauty that gave her the confidence to think that he would fall in love with her over time. Yi Muyun's gaze was deep. Zheng Xini's heart skipped a beat. She felt uneasy and even more nervous. Chapter 2265. She firmly believed that after Tang Sher got married, had a husband and children, any smart man would give up on Tang Sher. After all, with Mr. Ye's status, it was impossible for him to accept a divorced woman. But after a few seconds, Yi Muyun slowly walked to the desk, pressed the intercom, and said in an indifferent tone, "Get the people from the HR department and the security guards here." Zheng Xini was stunned for a moment, and then she took a step back. "Mr. Yi. I was wrong." Yi Muyun didn't speak. He just took out a cigarette and lit it with a lighter. In the blue flame, Zheng Xini clearly saw his eyes, which were deep and cold. This gaze made Zheng Xini understand that he would never accept her. The security guards came quickly, and the manager of the HR department quickly understood the situation. When he looked at Zheng Xini, his expression was a little disdainful. Another woman who overestimated herself. Was Mr. Yi such a casual man? What gave her the confidence to think that now that there was a change in Boyi, Mr. Yi and Miss would be finished? No one could tell what would happen tomorrow until the end of the story. Zheng Xini left Boyi. Before she left, Yi Muyun suddenly said in an indifferent tone, "Do you know why I kept you alive until now?" Zheng Xini didn't say anything. "What you did for Zhou Chongguang was enough to put you in jail for a few years, but now, there's no need for that. Take care of yourself." Yi Muyun's tone was very indifferent as he gave her the final answer. Zheng Xini was stunned. She had never thought that he knew about it. But after all these years, why didn't he expose her? As if he knew what she was thinking, Yi Muyun's voice was indifferent. "Because you are her past. I just keep her past by her side, and she will be angry." Zheng Xini took a deep breath. It was just like that. So, it was just like that. She used to work for Zhou Chongguang, but later on, her feelings for Zhou Chongguang faded. He was no longer the piano prince that she liked. Her eyes began to involuntarily chase after Yi Muyun. Compared to Zhou Chongguang, Yi Muyun was more loyal. She liked his steadfastness, but she also hated it. Just like now, she had lost to his steadfastness. She had not lost to Tang Xue, but to Yi Muyun. Her love was not worth mentioning in front of him. If she said it now, she would only be humiliating herself. Zheng Xini left with her remaining pride, but when no one was around, it shattered into pieces. However, no one cared about this. Standing in front of the Boyi building, Zheng Xini understood one thing. She would never become the heroine of those outstanding men, because she was ordinary to begin with. In the top floor office of the Boyi building, Yi Muyun was still standing alone. Gu Zhe knocked on the door and entered. "Mr. Yi, we've tried our best to recall all the printed publications. We've also cleared the mainstream media on the internet, but we can't do anything about those that have been downloaded." Yi Muyun nodded. "Thank you for your hard work." He turned around slowly and looked at Gu Zhe. "How is she?" At this moment, he didn't care about the changes in the Boyi building. He only cared about how she was. Would she be angry after seeing these photos? Gu Zhe hesitated for a moment. "These 2 days, Cher has been staying in the hotel and hasn't gone out. The photos must have affected her, but I found out something." Chapter 2266. Finally, Gu Zhe said, "Lan Yu has a female assistant who has been with him for about 10 years. I heard that they were university classmates. That woman followed Lan Yu the moment they graduated. That woman came to be city these past 2 days. Just this morning, she arranged to meet Cher. As for what they talked about, because it was a private room, I have no way of knowing. What about Lan Yu? Does he know? Yi Muyun asked. Guzhe said mildly, he probably doesn't know. Because after Yang Yani met, she immediately took the earliest flight back to New York. She should be on the plane now. Yi Muyun nodded. Get someone to follow her and bring her here if necessary. I have something to ask her. Guzhe grunted and left. Cher walked into the study of the hotel suite. She looked at Lan Yu, pursed her lips and asked softly, why did you do that? Lan Yu was on the phone. He was probably talking to his personal assistant, Yang Yani, in New York. After hearing Cher's words, he turned his head and said to Yang Yani calmly, I'll call back later. With that, he hung up. Cher looked at her brand new phone and tilted her head. Don't tell me you lost your phone. Yes, I lost it. Lan Yu said calmly. Because of those photos. Cher pursed her lips. I want to ask, why do you have those photos? Why did they fall into the hands of the reporters? Lan Yu's lips curled into a smile. Cher, you really don't know why. He took a step forward, while Shui took 2 steps back. Her face was filled with distrust. Lan Yu's gaze was deep, his thin lips slowly spitting out a few words. Because I care. So you took those photos on purpose to hurt him? Really? Cher's eyes were filled with suspicion. Lan Yu, what are you doing? Our marriage is fake. We didn't even register it. We only have a marriage certificate that can foolish you. Don't tell me you want to turn this fake marriage into reality. Cher pursed her lips. You know I can leave any time and I don't even need to be restrained. Lan Yu's face was filled with anger. I can make that piece of paper real at any time. I missed a number on the passport, Cher said quickly, successfully making Lan Yu's expression change. He had never expected Tang Shui to be so scheming. At that time, she was clearly on the verge of death. She signed whatever he asked her to sign. Towards the benefactor who saved her life, she was almost obedient. Unexpectedly, she still had this last trick up her sleeve. Do you know why I was able to fool them so easily? Snow's voice was very soft. Lan Yu frowned and looked at her. Because of Yang Yani. Cher's voice was cold. I didn't know what kind of relationship you had with her at first. I always thought you were pure until I saw this. There was a phone in Cher's hand. You were too careless. Lan Yu's expression changed. In this, apart from the photos you took for me, there are also photos of you and Yang Yani. Cher said clearly, you and her are in a relationship. So, there was a mistake in their marriage certificate when it was passed through Yang Yani's hands. Such a low-level mistake would never happen in the hands of a professional secretary. Chapter 2267. After Cher said that, Lan Yu's expression turned extremely ugly. He still stood there and smiled faintly. Yes, we were once in a relationship, but after we got married, I didn't touch her again. We were never married. Cher scoffed coldly. Lan Yu, don't lie to yourself. Cher raised her hand and threw a stack of photos at Lan Yu's face. This is the answer, and also your plot to get close to me, isn't it? Those photos were like snowflakes falling on Lan Yu's face, tearing their faces apart. Living together for 5 years wasn't enough to make up for the one time he had hurt Yi Muyun. Lan Yu didn't know why, but he felt sad. It wasn't for Lan Ting, but for himself. He lowered his head and looked at the photos at his feet, smiling faintly. All these years mean nothing to you, right? Cher pursed her lips and said stubbornly, yes. However, there were tears in her eyes. For 5 years, she had always treated him like a brother, like a teacher. But he had a motive for getting close to her. It was because of his sister. 10 years ago, when Yi Muyun was studying abroad in New York, your sister, Lan Ting, was crazy about him. But after failing to pursue him, she jumped off a building. Cher's voice was indifferent, but it also cruelly dug out the hurt in Lan Yu's heart. So, you thought that the best way to take revenge on him was to make it so that we could never be together. You married me, but you couldn't accept being with me, so you used many methods. Cher looked at him and asked slowly, what about Ishu? Is he your and Yang Yanni's child? Is it fair to him to do this? Lan Yu's lips curled up coldly. There's nothing unfair to him. He's my son. Cher closed her eyes slightly. I'll take him away. Leave. Lan Yu went forward, held her shoulders and narrowed his eyes. Where do you want to go? Take Ishu back to New York. Cher broke free from him. You're crazy. I can't let Ishu be with you. Ishu was such a cute child. She didn't want him to live in a world full of hatred. But just as she struggled free, Lan Yu grabbed her hand again. His face was full of anger. What about my sister? Did she die for nothing? You're so stubborn. You clearly know that she's taking things too hard for herself. It has nothing to do with Yi Muyun. Cher pursed her lips and looked at Lan Yu. Both of you are sick. Just as she finished speaking, her body was folded into his embrace. His arms were like steel, locking her in place. He said in a low voice, since you already know everything, I don't mind telling you some more things. Cher was stunned. All that was left on Lan Yu's face was gloomy and filled with hatred. This was far beyond what Cher had imagined. Lan Yu had always been a gentleman with a melancholic temperament. But now, his face was filled with hostility. Do you know about Zhou Chongguang's father? Lan Yu lowered his head and moved closer to her ear. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate arrangement. Cher's eyes widened in shock. She didn't know that from that moment on, Lan Yu had already seeped into her life. He was too scary. Chapter 2268. Cher's body was trembling. What do you want to do? If I destroy you, do you think he will still want you? Lan Yu's voice was low and hoarse. I heard that he almost went crazy just by looking at those photos. Cher narrowed her eyes and raised her hand. She slapped Lan Yu hard. You're crazy. He took the slap and didn't fight back. He just held her in his arms and kissed her fiercely. Cher was scared out of her wits. She tried her best to move her face away from him, but he always had a way of finding her. In the end, he bit down on her neck with such force that it was as if he was going to swallow her whole. Cher kicked and hit him, but he didn't let go. Bright red blood flowed down from her little neck, dripping down bit by bit. She looked like a small animal on the verge of death. She knew that if Lan Yu didn't let her go, she wouldn't be able to escape. She pinched his arm and said hoarsely, Lan Yu, is it worth it to sacrifice your whole life for someone who has already left? Lan Yu finally let go. He looked at the blood on her fair skin and his eyes darkened. Is it worth it? She's also my sister. Cher touched her neck and looked at Lan Yu. She got straight to the point. The person you like is your sister. Lan Yu's face changed. For so many years, that kind of shameful, taboo, and the anger of being exposed. The look in his eyes became terrifying. When Cher wanted to escape, he pulled her into his arms from behind. I want you now. I should have done it long ago. He whispered in her ear. This way, you can't escape anymore. Cher was stunned for a moment and screamed, "No, let go of me. Lan Yu, you pervert." She had a deep fear. If young Yanni hadn't deliberately exposed her, she didn't know how long she would have hurt Yimuyun. And their separation was all because of Lan Yu. She had even lived by Lan Yu's side for so long. Cher bit her lips and didn't let him succeed. However, Lan Yu's fingers pinched her chin. She was in pain and was forced to open her lips. At that moment, Cher was extremely embarrassed and angry. Her eyes stared at Lan Yu like a stranger. Moreover, it was filled with disgust. Lan Yu suddenly couldn't stand this kind of gaze. He narrowed his eyes and said, "I will make you do it willingly." With that, he dragged her into the study room with one hand and took out a pill with the other, stuffing it into her mouth. Cher turned her face away, refusing to eat, but he pressed her down and forced her to swallow it. It melted in her mouth and was very sweet. However, Cher immediately guessed what it was. There was fear in her eyes. She thought she knew what he wanted to do. Lan Yu's face was no longer gentle. What was left was only a twisted expression of revenge. He dragged her into his bedroom, turned on the infrared camera and turned on the lights in the bedroom. He threw her onto the bed and stood at the end of the bed, looking at her from above. There was a faint light in his eyes. "Since you already know, there's no need to hide." He bent down and bit her lips. "Now, let's start a new relationship, okay?" Cher looked at him in horror. She bit her lip so hard that it almost bled. Chapter 2269. She widened her eyes and watched as he inched towards her step by step. Just as he was about to kiss her lips, a timid voice came from the door. "Daddy," there was a tinge of timidity and fear in that soft voice. Lan Yu's body, which was already in a frenzy, suddenly cooled down. He turned his head and looked at the door. Xiao Yishu stood by the door. She was wearing a set of lamb pajamas and looked especially adorable. There was a puzzled look on his little face. He did not understand why Daddy was pressing down on Mommy and why Mommy was crying. Although there were scenes of adults kissing on TV, it was obvious that Daddy and Mommy were different. The little boy stood at the door and his big eyes were filled with tears. However, the little lamb was a little man and did not cry. If he were to cry, Mommy would definitely cry even harder. No matter how angry Lan Yu was, his heart softened a little as he looked at Xiao Yishu. He rolled to the side and calmed himself down before turning to look at Cher. He said in a hoarse voice, "I'll get the doctor here." The medicine was quite strong. If there was no man, she would have to get an injection. Cher closed her eyes and tried her best not to hug him. She did not want to lose her composure in front of Xiao Yishu. Lan Yu sat up and smiled at Xiao Yishu. "Mommy is sick." "Daddy, get the doctor here." "Really?" The little boy ran over and half knelt beside Cher. He reached out to touch her forehead and said in a childish voice, "Mommy, don't cry. You'll be fine after the doctor gives you an injection." Then, she felt a soft little boy in her arms. There was a milky scent on his body. It was a scent that she was familiar with. It was her salvation. Lan Yu leaned against the headboard and his eyes fell on the mother and son. He called the Lan family doctor over in a calm tone. Cher suppressed her voice and said, "Just get the hotel doctor." He pressed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Do you think I'll let Yimuyun know what happened between us? Do you think we can still live in harmony like before?" Cher clenched her teeth, closed her eyes, and pressed Xiao Yishu into her arms. No matter how ignorant Xiao Yishu was, she knew that her parents were quarreling, and the problem was serious. The little guy bit his lip, then hugged Lan Yu and burst into tears. "Daddy, don't bully mommy. Lan Yu had a little thing in his arms. After all, he was the one who brought her up, so his heart softened a little. He was about to say something, but Cher had already turned over from the side of the bed and fled toward the door. Lan Yu was shocked. She had been fed that drug and it would be very dangerous for her to go out now. There was a high chance that she had found a man to sleep with. He couldn't care less. He pushed Xiao Yishu aside and chased after her. But this push caused Xiao Yishu's forehead to hit the corner of the bed, and a trace of blood flowed out. It was clearly a small wound, but the blood kept flowing like a thin line of water. Lan Yu cursed. At this moment, Xiao Yishu's life and Cher's chastity were placed together. He chose his son's life. He knew that she would come back. For Yishu, she would come back. Moreover, those photos had already cut off her escape route. Chapter 2270. Xiao Yishu was still crying softly. Lan Yu comforted him gently, then carried him out and drove to the hospital. Xiao Yishu had a special constitution. It was difficult to stop bleeding once he touched it. Moreover, he had H-negative blood, and Lan Yu happened to have H-negative blood as well. It seemed that it was God's arrangement. Xiao Yishu should be Lan Yu's son. At this time, Lan Yu had no other choice. Yishu was in trouble. Everything he had was gone. As Lan Yu drove, this thought popped up in his mind, and he asked himself, what's going on? What did he have all these years? Was he already reluctant to part with it? Reluctant to part with this seemingly warm family? Did he take it seriously? Was it because he had been acting for too long and was too immersed in it? His feelings were complicated. He was worried about Cher's drug. He wanted to make a call, but she must not have brought her phone when she went out like that. In the end, he called the hotel manager on duty and told her that his wife had drunk a little. He asked them to help look for her, and he was taking his son to the hospital. No one dared to neglect Mrs. Lan. They couldn't find her, so they turned on the surveillance cameras to look for her. In the end, they confirmed that Cher was sitting at the door of the suite on the top floor. She was very thin. The manager on duty heaved a sigh of relief. Just as he was about to call Lan Yu, a friend beside him bit her finger. Miss Tang doesn't look right. Are you sure you want to call Lan Yu and not Mr. Yi? The manager on duty pursed his lips. In the end, he changed his mind and called Yi Muyun. His words were the same as Lan Yu's. He said that Tang Yishu had drunk too much and was now at the door of the presidential suite on the top floor. Yi Muyun arrived in 5 minutes. He happened to pass by here just now. Gu Zhe was also with him. When the elevator on the top floor opened, Yi Muyun looked at Cher and raised his hand, signaling Gu Zhe not to follow him. He could tell that something was wrong with Cher just by looking at her eyes. Should I call a doctor? Gu Zhe asked softly. He could also see that not only her eyes, but the skin on her body was also flushed. He could tell at a glance that she had taken some medicine. The manager on duty came from the other side and said in a low voice, Mr. Yi, Mr. Lan said he took his son to the hospital. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and said to Gu Zhe, go check it out. Gu Zhe nodded and gestured for the manager to follow him. The manager didn't know what to say and asked, don't you want to call the doctor? Gu Zhe wanted to curse. Didn't he see that Cher didn't need a doctor? She needed his man. Chairman Yi was his mother's man. The manager was scared by Vice President Gu's sharp eyes. He shrank back and immediately followed him into the elevator. Gu Zhe looked at him and said coldly, do you know the consequences if you say a word about what happened today? After all, Tang Cher was married now. It would be very disadvantageous if she and Mr. Yi got into trouble. The manager swallowed hard and immediately nodded to show that he understood. What else could he not understand? What he wanted was that Mr. Yi wanted to sleep with Miss Gu. Miss Gu was married, but Mr. Yi had to give the antidote himself. She had a husband, and she could find a doctor. Mr. Yi didn't need to do this kind of thing in person. If he did it, it could only mean one thing. Mr. Yi wanted it himself. Chapter 2271. At the entrance of the presidential suite, Yi Muyun was stunned when he reached out and touched Cher. She was burning hot, her entire body was burning hot. He narrowed his eyes. What did she eat? Who fed her the medicine? Was it Lan Yu? Yi Muyun reached out to pick her up and kicked open the door of the suite. She had been curled up in his arms and had not struggled at all. Her body was burning hot, but her mind was wandering. She gritted her teeth and endured it. She was hot and cold at the same time. She only knew that she was in Yi Muyun's arms and she felt very safe. At that moment, she didn't want to think about anything else. She just wanted to stay with him quietly for a while. The past, the separation, Lan Yu, Zhou Chongguang, and Qin Mu were all gone. In this suite, there were only the two of them. Her and her brother. Cher suddenly opened her eyes and looked at him with watery eyes. Her voice had a tinge of impatience, like a kitten in the village, teasing him without knowing it. Brother. Yi Muyun's voice was as deep as water. He replied and placed her on the spacious sofa. She leaned on his knees and started kissing his chin, his cheeks, just like a little baby beast. There was a fire in his arms. He wanted her, but he still cared. It would be a lie to say that he didn't care. He cared that she belonged to someone else in the past, and he cared that she still belonged to someone else now. Tell me, who fed you the medicine? He pressed his forehead against hers and asked her in a low voice. Her eyes were misty and wide open. She shook her head. No, no one. Her entire body was in pain, but her mind was clear. She knew what it would mean if she told him. It would mean that she would lose Ishu, and it would mean that there would be a bloodbath in Beast City. She had fallen out with Lan Yu, but for the sake of Ishu, she knew that it would not come to that. However, her heart was also sad. Between her and Ishu, or between revenge and Ishu, Lan Yu had chosen Ishu, and she had also chosen Ishu among the hatred. After going through so many ugly things, she was unwilling to give up on that little person. Even if he was Lan Ishu's son, in Cher's heart, he was her own child. Her body was very hot, but she was crying. She didn't know how many times she begged him. She didn't know how cold his eyes were when he looked at her. However, when he kissed her, his clothes fell off one by one. His trousers, a shirt, and her remaining clothes were thrown on the floor, piled together, looking extremely intimate. The effects of her drug were extremely long-lasting. He used the entire night to calm the restlessness in her body. When she woke up, he was still there. He was already dressed, looking impeccably dressed. He was standing at the head of the bed, looking at her with a deep gaze. Cher's body froze for a moment. Instinctively, she pulled the blanket higher and pursed her lips. Isn't it too late to block yourself now? Mrs. Lan. His tone was a little mocking. Then, he walked towards the living room and said as he walked, "We can talk." Talk? She didn't understand. What could they talk about? Could it be Boyi? Or their relationship? She felt a little guilty. No matter what, she was the one who used him last night. She knew the limits of a man's stamina, and they seemed to have done it no less than 5 times last night, and each time it took about an hour. He woke up early in the morning. Was there anything wrong with his body? Chapter 2272. She let her imagination run wild, but she didn't forget that Ishu was in the hospital now. When she escaped, Lan Yu pushed Ishu. She remembered that Lan Yu didn't chase after her, so he must have taken Ishu to the hospital. Pursing her lips, she lifted the blanket and got out of bed. When she landed, the corner of her mouth was twisted because it was too painful. Actually, by the end of last night, the effects of the drug had already worn off. It was completely a one-sided demand from him. She was in great pain, but he didn't stop. It seemed like he was punishing her, but more like he was punishing himself. Cher's heart was a little gloomy. He probably didn't want to go to bed with her. After all, she was a married woman. She didn't know how to tell him what she knew. Could she tell him that because a girl jumped off a building for him, Lan Yu took revenge on her, causing them to be separated all these years? She wouldn't pretentiously think that it was Yi Muyun's fault. It was her fault. She wasn't ruthless enough. Just Ishu alone was enough to hold her back. Young Yani wanted her to find the answer herself, but she didn't know how to find it. Was there any secret about Lan Yu that she didn't know? Before Yang Yani left, she said something meaningful, and the truth is right beside you. When you find it, you can get rid of Lan Yu. Trust me, before that, don't leave him easily, or you will lose the most precious thing in your life. She didn't like Yang Yani, but she was always afraid of what that woman said. She put on a shirt absent-mindedly, didn't realize it was his, and went straight to the living room. Breakfast had already been delivered. Yi Muyun stood by the window and said calmly, "Go to the hospital later to see your son." Cher's body trembled. "Are you surprised?" He turned to look at her, his expression depressed. "Mrs. Lan, I really want to know if you thought about your husband when you were in my arms last night." "Huh?" Cher covered her face with her hands and chuckled softly. She knew that he didn't sleep for nothing. This revolt was just the beginning. "You can call a doctor," she said softly. But he was still suppressing it. "Yes, I can call a doctor. But what about you, Tang Cher? Can you call a doctor too? Instead of waiting for me at the entrance of the suite where we once spent our engagement night. You knew that the hotel staff could find you, so you were waiting for me here. Waiting for me to come to you, right?" He even approached her slowly and pinched her chin, forcing her to look up at him. His deep gaze searched her little face. "Does Lan Yu know that you slept with your ex again?" As her little face paled, he smiled again. "He probably doesn't know how many times we did it on the Yunnan trip. When he had sex with you, didn't he feel that his wife's body was different? Don't you feel like you've done it with someone else?" He whispered into her ear. Cher's face turned pale, and she couldn't say a word. At this moment, even if she said that she didn't have sex with Lan Yu, he wouldn't believe her. The photos that Lan Yu posted online. She chuckled. He was really good. He had cut off her escape route. He had taken advantage of a man's psychology and posted those photos. Any man would mind. But she didn't understand. "Does Mr. Yi think I'm dirty?" Cher raised her little face. "He thinks I'm dirty, but he still slept with me." Chapter 2273. Is that so? But I think that Mr. Yi seems to be enjoying it. She was infuriated and argued with him. Yi Muyun tightened her grip on her chin. When her face turned pale, Yi Muyun suddenly let go of her and faintly smiled with a hint of mockery. "Yes, I enjoyed it. After all, Mrs. Shou is very beautiful." Cher was furious. She reached out and wanted to slap him, but her arm was caught in midair. He lowered his head and looked at her with a burning gaze. "Why? You're not going to admit it now that you've enjoyed it, huh?" Letting go of her, Cher took 2 steps back and continued to glare at him. However, she didn't want to argue with him. She was very hungry. She hadn't eaten for the whole day. She sat at the dining table and ate slowly. She was very quiet. It wasn't like her in the past. Yi Muyun just looked at her. He thought about how she used to look at him dozens of times when she ate. She would tell him, "Brother, I don't want to eat this. Brother, I don't want to eat that." He still remembered that last night, when she was at her weakest, she had hugged his neck and called him brother. He just stood there and looked at her with a deep gaze. "Tang Cher, do you love him?" Cher's hand that was holding the fork trembled. She looked up at him. Then, she looked down and asked softly, "Is he very important to you?" Yi Muyun snorted softly. "What do you think?" Cher's heart thumped twice, but she calmed herself down. She smiled faintly and imitated him. "What do you think?" His expression didn't look too good as he glared at her. Snow ate very quickly, probably because she was really in a hurry. After she finished eating, she stood up and looked at him. "Can you send me to the hospital? Aren't you afraid that Lan Yu will find out about us having sex?" Yi Muyun calmly took out a cigarette and put it on his lips. He lit it and took a puff. Cher wiped her lips and walked towards the changing room. "It's already happened. Is Mr. Yi still shy?" She stood at the entrance of the changing room, a small flame burning in her eyes. "Mr. Yi, did you not think it through before you did it with me? I'm just anxious to see you." His gaze deepened as he said slowly. Cher's face turned red, then white, then red. Finally, she didn't say anything and went inside to change her clothes. When she came out, she found that Yi Muyun had also put on his coat and was holding the car keys in his hand. When they got into the car, his voice was very calm. "You don't look like a particularly anxious mother." Cher buckled her seatbelt and looked up at him. "Yi Muyun, if it were you, do you think you would immediately go to see your own child with a messy appearance after having sex with an extramarital man?" Yi Muyun's fingers, which had been holding the steering wheel, suddenly moved to her lips. He sneered. "Mrs. Lan, you seem to be used to secretly eating." Cher turned her little face away. "It's none of your business." He pinched her little chin and his gaze was burning. She couldn't stand his scrutinizing gaze. "Yi Muyun, if you don't want to send me, I can go to the hospital myself." He chuckled, let go of his hand, and started the car. Along the way, the two of them didn't say a word. They each had their own thoughts. When they arrived at the hospital, he stopped the car. Cher unbuckled her seatbelt and said calmly, "Thank you. Goodbye." "Are you thanking me for sending you here, or thanking me for satisfying you for one night, Mrs. Lan?" His voice was still mocking. Chapter 2274. Is this all you've got? There was a hint of mockery in his voice. Or is Lan Yu unable to satisfy you at all? Cher glared at him. Who drugged me? Did Mrs. Lan do it for fun when Mr. Lan wasn't at home? He said casually, then glanced at her again, and his voice became even more unhurried. Or did you miss me? If that's what Mr. Yi thinks, I have no objections, Cher said with a fake smile. With that, she opened the car door and was about to get out. At that moment, he grabbed her slender arm and said, "Are you sure you want to go back to him?" Cher's body froze. At that moment, there was no hurt or argument between them. They were just a grown-up man and a woman. They were the most intimate people in the world. She thought that he was really good to her. If a man felt betrayed, he would still ask her if she wanted to go back to him even when he was about to force her to abdicate. In the eyes of the outside world, she had a husband and a child. Did he still want her like that? She felt sweet and sour in her heart. Then, she pursed her lips and looked at him sideways. Yi Muyun, take a guess. With that, she opened the car door and got out. He didn't follow her out, but sat in the car and looked at her back. He looked at her and thought about the time they spent together after they reunited. Suddenly, he narrowed his eyes. Her waist was so slender. It was obvious that she didn't look like a woman who had given birth to a child. She was still like a young girl. And, when they had sex again, he felt that she was in pain. If she had given birth naturally and maintained a long-term relationship with Lan Yu, there was no reason for her to be in so much pain. She didn't look like a married woman who would fool around after getting married. And last night, although she had been drugged, she had clearly taken the initiative to pester him and ask him not to stop. All of this made him feel that her marriage with Lan Yu wasn't that simple. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and clenched his slender fingers. Cher walked into the hospital without a shred of hesitation. The fear she had felt the night before vanished instantly. She was no longer afraid of Lan Yu. No matter how scheming Lan Yu was, he had a weakness. She suddenly stopped and ran back. Yi Muyun's car was still there. The window was open and he was smoking in the car. He wasn't surprised to see her come back, but just looked at her indifferently. Suddenly, she felt that Lan Yu had become a bad person. Her whole body felt relaxed. It was as if she did not owe him anything. It was as if she could turn back. But she didn't know if Yi Muyun still wanted her. She felt uneasy and wanted to ask him if he could wait for her, but she was too flustered. When she asked, the meaning of her words changed. Yi Muyun, will you save me again next time? His face darkened, and he put out the cigarette. Mrs. Lan, solve it yourself next time. She bit her lip and said in a delicate voice, how can I solve it myself? His face turned even darker, as though he was looking at her for the first time. Then, he sneered, I can teach you for free. With that, he started the car and left. Cher stood there, watching his car drive away. Then, she burst out laughing. Chapter 2275. When Yi Muyun's car arrived at the entrance of the hospital, he suddenly stopped and let out a long sigh. He was faced with a huge temptation. He didn't know if it was poisonous, but he had already swallowed half of it. If she and Lan Yu were on the same side and were deliberately lying to him, then he would probably be doomed if he swallowed another half. He leaned against the steering wheel, his head aching. There wasn't much time left. There had to be a conclusion between him, Lan Yu, and Cher. If she was happy, he would let her be happy because she had a son. Even if he had to get Boyi, it was for the sake of her safety. He didn't trust anyone. What he wanted was to protect the Tang family for her, so that she would have a place to return to no matter what. Whether he was happy or not wasn't that important. Song Karen had already made him very angry. Song Karen had made him realize that he couldn't love anyone else, even if he forced it. He called Guze. Arrange for someone to keep an eye on Lan Yu. He paused for a moment. Also, create some trouble for Boyi. I need to make a trip to New York. Remember, the biggest shareholder has to come with me if the trouble is big enough. Guze immediately understood and nodded. Okay. Yi Muyun slowly drove the car away from the hospital while Cher walked into the inpatient department. Xiao Yishu had not woken up yet and was lying on the hospital bed while Lan Yu stood by the hospital window. He had probably heard the sound of the door opening because he said calmly, "Who did you look for last night?" He had called back to the hotel, but she hadn't returned to her room. The hotel staff were mumbling. He wasn't sure at first, but he had seen Yi Muyun's car just now. What was there to be uncertain about? They had slept together last night. Lan Yu turned around and looked at Snow, who was standing by the door. He smiled and said, "Did you look for him? Does it matter who I slept with?" Cher walked in and sat by the bed, looking at Xiao Yishu. She said in a low voice, "Lan Yu, aren't you tired of living in hatred? You know it's not his fault. He just rejected your sister." Lan Yu's gaze was deep. "You want to say, return to his side, huh?" Cher shook her head. "I'm curious. After what happened last night, why did you still dare to return to my side?" Lan Yu smiled faintly. "Because I saved you." Cher lowered her eyes and looked at him again. "Because I'm your wife on the outside. What does it mean for me to be with him now?" His expression was one of disgust. "You really don't hide your feelings at all." "Yes, I love him." Cher was fearless. "Lan Yu, I've already called Yang Yani just now to announce to the public that our marriage is a misunderstanding and that it's illegal." She said word by word, "I think she'd be happy to do such a thing." She had laid her cards on the table, but Lan Yu was still unmoved. He looked at her quietly and pursed his lips. After a long while, he said softly, "You came back just to say this?" He probably knew what she was thinking. She wanted to protect that man. In her own way. He's already taking action against Bo Yi. Soon, the Tang family will no longer be Bo Yi's master. "Are you sure that man loves you the most and not Bo Yi?" Cher smiled. "I believe him. I'll believe him even if I die." Lan Yu closed his eyes. "What about me?" His body shook when he asked the question. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with shock because of what he had just said. "You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."